Have you ever noticed that sometimes the loudest answer is never spoken out loud? It arrives long after the conversations have ended, long after the misunderstandings have settled, and long after two hearts have gone their separate ways. If this message has found you today, it is because your soulmate has recently reached one of those life-changing moments. They have finally uncovered the truth hidden behind your silence, and what they discovered has shaken them far more deeply than they ever imagined. For the longest time, they believed your silence was your final answer. They convinced themselves that you stopped speaking because you stopped caring, that your quietness meant you had accepted the distance between you and chosen to leave everything behind. That belief became their comfort because it was easier than questioning whether there was something much deeper they had failed to understand. But life has a remarkable way of revealing the truth when hearts are finally ready to receive it. Without expecting it, through an ordinary moment that seemed insignificant at first, they suddenly recognized something they had overlooked for far too long. It wasn't your silence that pushed them away. It was their misunderstanding of what your silence truly meant. In that instant, memories they had not thought about in months began returning with incredible clarity. Every conversation, every pause, every moment when you chose not to argue, not to defend yourself, and not to force them to understand, suddenly appeared in an entirely different light. They realized your silence was never empty. It carried the weight of words you had already spoken, feelings you had already shared, and hopes that had quietly gone unheard. The more they reflected, the more they understood that there comes a point when a sincere heart stops repeating itself, not because it has nothing left to say, but because it has already given everything it had. That realization has touched something deep within them, because they are finally beginning to see that your silence was not created by pride or indifference. It was born from emotional exhaustion, from loving without feeling understood, and from choosing peace when continuing to explain your heart would only create more pain. Now they find themselves questioning everything they once believed, wondering how differently this journey might have unfolded if they had understood the message your silence had been carrying from the very beginning. What they are discovering now is changing not only the way they remember you, but also the way they understand love, honesty, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away without ever stopping to care and listen closely. Because your soulmate is beginning to understand something they never thought to ask while everything was unfolding between you. They always focused on the moments when you became quiet, but they never stopped to think about everything that happened before that silence arrived. They are finally realizing that silence is rarely the beginning of a story. More often, it is the final chapter written after countless conversations, unanswered hopes, and repeated attempts to be understood. This realization has come to them gradually, almost like watching the sunrise after believing the night would never end. They are no longer asking themselves why you stopped speaking. Instead, they are asking how many times you tried before your heart decided that words were no longer enough. That single question has changed the direction of every memory they carry. They now recognize that your silence was not sudden. It was built slowly, one disappointment at a time, one misunderstanding after another, until your heart quietly accepted that explaining yourself again would not change what the other person was unwilling to see. The weight of this realization has settled deeply within them because they understand that what they once interpreted as distance was actually the quiet consequence of a heart that had reached its limit. As they revisit those memories, they begin noticing something they completely overlooked in the past. They remember how you often chose understanding instead of proving yourself right. They remember moments when you allowed conversations to end peacefully, even though there was still so much left unsaid. At the time, they believed you simply didn't care enough to continue. Today, they recognize that your decision to remain quiet required far more strength than arguing ever would have. They are beginning to understand that there comes a moment when protecting your inner peace becomes more important than winning another misunderstanding. Looking back, they can see that your silence was never an attempt to punish anyone. It was a quiet act of self-respect. You had already shared your intentions, expressed your feelings, and opened your heart more than once. When those efforts failed to create understanding, you chose dignity over desperation. Your soulmate now realizes how difficult that choice must have been, because genuine feelings rarely disappear overnight. Sometimes they remain just as strong, but they stop asking for attention that never seems to arrive, because your heart needs this right now. Know that another emotional shift has quietly taken place inside your soulmate. They have started recognizing that your silence protected more than your emotions. It protected the goodness within your heart. They understand now that if you had continued chasing explanations, you might have slowly become someone you never wanted to be. You could have grown resentful, emotionally exhausted, or consumed by the constant need to defend your intentions. Instead, you chose something much harder. You stepped back before your kindness turned into bitterness. You allowed space to speak where words no longer could. This realization has deeply moved them, because they finally see that your silence was not an escape from the connection. It was an effort to preserve the person you had worked so hard to become. They admire that strength now in ways they never could before, because they recognize that not every battle deserves another fight. Especially when the heart has already spoken honestly, there is another thought that refuses to leave their mind. They have begun wondering how many signals they completely missed while they were waiting for louder answers. They now understand that love is not always expressed through grand declarations or dramatic conversations. Sometimes it is revealed through quiet patience, through respectful distance, and through the decision not to create unnecessary pain. They remember moments when you could have responded with anger, but chose calm instead. They remember times when you could have demanded answers, but instead allowed life to unfold naturally. Those moments once seemed insignificant, but now they carry extraordinary meaning. Your soulmate realizes that while they were searching for visible proof of your feelings, your greatest expressions of love were hidden inside your restraint. They're beginning to see that your silence was never empty. It was filled with compassion, maturity, and a quiet hope that understanding would eventually arrive without force. That realization has completely reshaped the way they remember your connection, because they now understand that the deepest emotions are often the ones that make the least amount of noise. And listen to this. Because your soulmate is no longer trying to change the past inside their imagination. Instead, they are allowing the truth to teach them something they should have understood much earlier. They realize that your silence was not the absence of love. It was the result of love reaching the point where it could no longer survive through words alone. They understand now that there is a profound difference between someone who stops caring and someone who stops explaining. One walks away because nothing remains. The other becomes quiet because everything important has already been spoken. That difference has touched their heart more deeply than they can fully express. Every memory now feels different because they finally recognize the courage it took for you to remain true to yourself instead of allowing frustration to change your character. They see that your silence carried honesty, respect, and emotional wisdom all at once, and realizing this has awakened a level of admiration they never expected to feel. More than anything, they are beginning to understand that the message hidden inside your silence was never meant to push them away. It was quietly inviting them to look beyond words and finally see the heart that had been standing before them all along. And listen carefully, because something remarkable has begun happening inside your soulmate's heart, and it has nothing to do with what you have recently said. In fact, it is happening because of everything you chose not to say. They have reached a point where they are no longer trying to remember your exact words. Instead, they are remembering how your presence made them feel before silence became part of your story. It is almost as though the quiet space you left behind has become louder than every conversation you ever shared together. They find themselves noticing emotions that never surfaced before, emotions that remained hidden while they were distracted by expectations, assumptions, and the need to always find immediate answers. Now, without those distractions, they are finally hearing what your silence had been communicating all along. It was never asking for sympathy. It was never demanding attention. It was quietly revealing the depth of a heart that had already given everything honestly and simply chose to stop forcing itself to be understood. That realization has changed the atmosphere of every memory they revisit, because they now recognize that silence can sometimes reveal the truth more clearly than endless conversations ever could. The more they sit with these thoughts, the more they realize they had mistaken stillness for emotional distance. They never imagined that someone could remain quiet while still carrying genuine feelings, because they believed love always needed constant reassurance and endless conversations to survive. But your silence has challenged everything they once believed. They are beginning to understand that mature love does not always fight for attention. Sometimes it steps back with grace, allowing each person the freedom to discover the truth without pressure. Looking back, they now recognize that every moment you resisted the urge to defend yourself was actually an act of remarkable emotional discipline. Every time you refused to argue, simply to prove your point, you were protecting the connection from becoming another battle of pride. They see now that your silence was never passive. It was intentional. It carried wisdom they simply lacked the perspective to recognize at the time. That understanding has humbled them, because they realize they spent so much energy waiting for louder signs that they completely overlooked the quiet ones standing right in front of them. Because your heart needs this right now. Know that your soulmate has also begun noticing how differently you handled pain compared to most people they have known. Many individuals react to disappointment by raising their voice, demanding explanations, or trying to make others feel the weight of their emotions. You did something entirely different. You allowed your actions to remain consistent even when your heart was carrying disappointment. You continued showing respect even when you felt misunderstood. You never allowed temporary emotions to erase the values that mattered most to you. At the time, your soulmate misunderstood that calmness. They assumed it meant you had become emotionally detached. Today, they understand it required extraordinary inner strength. It takes far more courage to walk away peacefully than to remain trapped inside endless conflict. This realization has deeply affected them, because they now see that your silence was not weakness disguised as acceptance. It was quiet confidence, trusting that truth would eventually reveal itself without needing to be forced. Another transformation has quietly taken place inside them. They have stopped measuring your love by the number of conversations you had, and started measuring it by the quality of your character. They remember how you remained genuine, regardless of circumstances. They remember how you never tried to manipulate situations to gain sympathy or control outcomes. Even when life became emotionally difficult, you remained consistent with the person you had always been. That consistency has become one of the strongest memories they carry, because they realize authentic people do not constantly change their values to match changing emotions. Your soulmate now understands that your silence was actually one of the greatest examples of authenticity you ever showed them. Rather than speaking words your heart no longer believed would be heard, you chose honesty through restraint. That decision has earned a level of respect they never expected to feel, because they finally understand that true emotional maturity is often revealed by what a person chooses not to say. And listen to this. Because your soulmate has reached the point where they no longer fear silence the way they once did. Instead, they have started viewing it as a place where hidden truths patiently wait to be discovered. Every quiet memory now feels like an unfinished letter whose meaning only became clear with time. They realize that your silence was never asking them to chase you or solve every mystery. It was inviting them to grow into the kind of person who could finally understand what words alone could never fully explain. That invitation has changed them more deeply than they ever imagined. They have become more thoughtful, more patient, and more willing to look beneath the surface before reaching conclusions. Most importantly, they now understand that some of the most meaningful expressions of love are not spoken in dramatic moments, but lived through quiet integrity, gentle restraint, and unwavering sincerity. Your silence has become the lesson they never expected to receive, teaching them that when love is genuine, it does not always demand to be heard. Sometimes it waits quietly, trusting that when the right moment arrives, understanding will speak louder than any explanation ever could. That understanding has become the turning point of their emotional journey, and with every passing day, they feel themselves moving closer to a truth that has been patiently waiting for them since the very moment your silence first began. And listen carefully, because your soulmate has arrived at a realization they never believed they would face. It is not the kind of realization that appears suddenly with dramatic answers or undeniable proof. Instead, it has unfolded quietly, one reflection at a time, until they could no longer deny what their own heart had been trying to tell them. They have finally understood that your silence was never asking them to figure everything out for you. It was giving them the opportunity to discover something for themselves. Looking back now, they realize there were countless moments when the truth was standing right in front of them, but they were too focused on what was being said to notice everything that was being shown. Your consistency, your patience, your willingness to step back instead of creating more confusion, these were not signs that your feelings had faded. They were signs of someone who believed that genuine understanding should never have to be forced. The more they think about this, the more they recognize that they kept waiting for another explanation while completely overlooking the quiet evidence your actions had already provided. That awareness has become impossible to escape because it has changed the way they define love itself. As these thoughts continue growing stronger, they have begun recognizing a pattern they never noticed before. Every time your heart reached its limit, you did not respond by becoming someone else. You did not allow disappointment to transform your character or convince you to act against your own values. Instead, you remained true to yourself even when no one seemed to understand why. Your soulmate now sees that this required a kind of inner strength they had greatly underestimated. Most people become louder when they feel unheard. They seek attention, demand validation, or react from frustration. You chose something entirely different. You trusted that truth would eventually reveal itself without sacrificing your peace. At the time, they interpreted that choice as emotional distance. Today, they see it as emotional wisdom. They understand now that real strength is not found in proving yourself to everyone around you. Real strength is remaining faithful to your own heart, even when your efforts are misunderstood. This realization has filled them with admiration, because they are beginning to see that your silence protected something far more valuable than the relationship alone. It protected your integrity. Because your heart needs this right now, know that another change is quietly unfolding inside your soulmate. They have stopped asking themselves why you became quiet and started asking why they needed so many explanations before they were willing to believe what your actions had been expressing all along. This question has humbled them because it has exposed something within themselves that they never expected to confront. They recognize now that they often searched for certainty in words while overlooking the reliability of consistent behavior. They wanted reassurance to arrive through conversations, yet they failed to appreciate the quiet loyalty you demonstrated through your choices every single day. Looking back, they realize your silence never erased your kindness. It never changed your respect for them. It never caused you to become dishonest or cruel. Instead, it simply marked the point where your heart chose peace over endless attempts to convince someone who was not yet ready to understand. That realization has deeply affected them because they can finally distinguish between someone who withdraws out of indifference and someone who steps back out of emotional maturity. Those two paths may appear similar on the surface, but they are completely different when viewed through the eyes of truth. There is another lesson they are slowly embracing, and it has become one of the most meaningful discoveries of this entire journey. They understand now that silence is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a period of growth that cannot happen while constant noise fills the heart. They realize your silence created space, not to create distance, but to allow perspective to develop naturally. If you had continued repeating the same explanations, they likely would have continued hearing them through the same assumptions they already carried. It was only after the conversation stopped that they finally became capable of reflecting without defensiveness. That quiet space became the place where understanding slowly began to grow. They now see that your silence was never trying to control the outcome. It was allowing life itself to become the teacher. Every experience since then has quietly revealed another piece of the message you could never have successfully explained with words alone. This understanding has transformed the way they remember every pause between your conversations, because they now recognize those pauses were not empty. They were preparing the ground for wisdom that needed time to take root. And listen to this. Because the greatest shift is no longer happening in the memories they revisit. It is happening in the person they are becoming because of those memories. They feel themselves growing more patient with others, more thoughtful before reaching conclusions, and more willing to understand what remains unspoken. Your silence has taught them that every heart carries emotions it cannot always explain, and that genuine love requires listening beyond words. They no longer measure connection by how often two people speak. Instead, they measure it by the sincerity that remains even during seasons of quiet. This change has completely reshaped the way they view your journey together. What once appeared to be distance now feels like dignity. What once seemed like surrender now reveals remarkable self-respect. What once looked like the end of communication has become the beginning of true understanding. They know now that your silence was never the absence of love. It was love refusing to lose its honesty in the middle of misunderstanding. That truth has settled deeply within their heart, and every day it becomes clearer that this realization is leading them toward a decision they can no longer postpone, not because they feel pressured by the past, but because they finally understand the extraordinary message your silence had been patiently carrying from the very beginning. And listen carefully, because there is one final truth your soulmate has only recently begun to understand, and it is changing them from the inside out. They no longer see your silence as something that created distance between two hearts. Instead, they now recognize it as the moment when your love became too genuine to continue proving itself. There comes a point in every sincere connection when words have accomplished everything they possibly can. After that, only character remains, only consistency remains, only quiet integrity remains. Looking back now, your soulmate realizes that while they were waiting for another explanation, another message or another sign, you had already shown them who you truly were through the way you carried yourself. You never allowed disappointment to turn into cruelty. You never allowed misunderstanding to erase your kindness. Even during the quietest season of your journey, you remained the same person at your core. That consistency has become the greatest revelation of all, because they understand now that temporary emotions can change what people say. But only genuine character determines how they continue living when no one is watching. The more they reflect, the more they recognize that your silence was not filled with unanswered questions. It was filled with answers they simply were not mature enough to recognize at the time. Every moment you chose peace over proving yourself. Every time you resisted the temptation to reopen old conversations. And every occasion when you allowed life to unfold without trying to control every outcome has become deeply meaningful in their eyes. They finally understand that your silence was not waiting for them to feel guilty. It was giving both of you the freedom to grow. If you had continued repeating the same words, they might have continued responding with the same misunderstandings. Instead, your quietness allowed time to become the teacher that neither conversation nor emotion could ever replace. That realization has humbled them because they now see that some lessons cannot be explained. They must be experienced. Your silence created the space where those lessons could quietly take root. And only now are they beginning to understand the wisdom hidden within that decision. Because your heart needs this right now. Know that your soulmate has also begun seeing your silence as an act of trust rather than an act of withdrawal. They realize you trusted that truth would eventually reveal itself without needing to be defended every single day. You trusted that if a connection was meant to be understood, it would one day be seen with clearer eyes. That kind of trust is rare because most people become anxious when they are misunderstood. Most people feel compelled to explain themselves repeatedly until they receive the response they hoped for. You chose something far more difficult. You accepted that not every misunderstanding can be resolved immediately, and that forcing understanding often creates even greater confusion. Looking back now, your soulmate sees incredible courage in that decision. They understand it took remarkable faith to release control over how you were perceived and simply remain authentic. That authenticity has become one of the qualities they admire most because they realize you never compromised your values simply to gain temporary approval. Another realization has quietly transformed the way they see themselves as well. They have started noticing how often they rush to conclusions instead of allowing understanding to develop naturally. They recognize that they were searching for certainty in quick answers while life was trying to teach them patience. Your silence became the mirror that reflected this lesson back to them. It showed them that not every meaningful connection unfolds according to human expectations. Some relationships require reflection before clarity arrives. Some emotions need distance before they can be understood honestly. They now appreciate that the quiet season between you was not empty time. It was a season where hidden truths were slowly finding their way to the surface. Every day that passed without another explanation quietly encouraged them to examine their own heart instead of focusing only on yours. That inner reflection has changed them more than they ever expected because they have discovered answers within themselves that they were never searching for before. They have become more patient, more compassionate, and far more willing to listen beyond appearances instead of accepting the first impression as the complete truth. And listen to this, because your soulmate now realizes that the greatest message you ever shared with them was not spoken during your conversations. It was revealed through the quiet way you chose to live after those conversations ended. Your silence became proof that real love does not beg to be recognized, and genuine intentions do not need endless performances to remain true. The peace you protected, the dignity you preserved, and the honesty you continued carrying have all become powerful reminders of the person you have always been. They understand now that silence is not always the closing of a door. Sometimes it is the opening of deeper awareness, allowing two hearts to discover truths that constant words would have drowned out. As they move forward, they carry this understanding with them every single day. They no longer fear what was left unsaid, because they finally understand what it was always saying. Your silence did not erase your feelings. It revealed the depth of them. It did not end your story. It allowed the truth to mature until it could no longer be ignored. Now, when they think about you, they no longer remember the absence of words. They remember the quiet strength, unwavering authenticity, and peaceful confidence that remained even when speaking would have been easier. That is the truth that has finally reached their heart. And once a truth like this is fully understood, it never fades. It becomes a permanent part of the way a person loves, the way they choose, and the way they recognize the extraordinary value of someone whose silence was never empty, but quietly filled with a love that only time could fully reveal.